Kabardan, good afternoon. I would like to start with an apology regarding the hesitancy about the venue to hold the event the last minute. I hope we can be excused. I would like to welcome you all to Dr. Gorčin Dizdar's lecture titled The Standing Stones of Medieval Bosnia, Heresy, Dualism, and Symbols in Pr-Ottoman Balkans. Dr. Gorčin Dizdar was born in Sarajevo in 1984. He attended primary schools in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and Germany, and completed his secondary school education in the UK. In 2003, he was awarded the Oxford Student Scholarship, which enabled him to study philosophy and German at the University of Oxford, where he achieved the highest results of his year at the final examination. After initially returning to Sarajevo in 2007, in 2009 he started his first MA and later a PhD in humanities at York University in Toronto, Canada, where he was awarded the Canada Vanier Graduate Scholarship, which was one of the most prestigious postgraduate scholarships awarded by the Canadian government. After completing his PhD in 2016, he returned to Sarajevo, working as the director of the Dizdar Foundation and teaching at the International University of Sarajevo, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and Social and Political Sciences program, for which I am the program coordinator and a professor. His essays were published in Bosnian, Canadian, and German journals, while his lyrical essay, The Stones of the Ancestors, was included in the selection of the Best Canadian Essays 2013. I would like to welcome Dr. Gorčin Dizdar on your behalf, and we are looking forward.
Well, thank you very much for this nice introduction and also for the invitation and opportunity to speak here today, and thanks to all of you who made it today to my lecture, especially my students. So I will try to give you a kind of condensed version of my PhD dissertation, hence this title, which was the same title as my dissertation. And what I will be talking about are the so-called standing stones of medieval Bosnia. It's actually one name, I gave them this name in English. Normally in Bosnian we call them stečak, which actually means the same thing, standing stone. And it also relates them to the wider phenomenon of standing stones, which we can find in different countries all over Europe, such as Ireland and also ancient France, etc. And the subtitle, Heresy, Dualism, and Symbols, it refers to the three analytical categories through which I approach this rather difficult topic, as we will see in this presentation. So let's just start with the very basic question: what is this standing stone, or the stečak, that I'm talking about? Here are some different names that we use in Bosnian: kam, mašet, mramor, bilig. So as you can see, basically what they are kind of quite, we can call them simple stone structures that we can find scattered all over the countryside. So this is probably their main characteristics, that they're always, outside, under the, under the sky, so to speak, which already is quite different from the usual type of gravestones that were constructed in this period in medieval Europe, because they were mainly constructed in the interiors of churches. And another characteristic is that they're monolithic, which means they're all constructed from one single block of stone. So, and also it's just a simple block, rather than, for example, You may be aware about ancient Roman sarcophagi that have a similar shape. However, they're usually hollowed out with the bones of the deceased being put inside. And these are the different, just a very short, simple introduction of the different shapes in which we can find the Stečak stones. And mainly, really, these four are actually more hypothetical, but the main shapes are here from 5 till 21. So the really three basic forms that we can find are these kind of flat stones that are quite common actually in the context of medieval Europe. And then these larger, like blocks, rectangular blocks, and then what's probably the most famous shapes, and if you ask somebody about the Stečak stone today, they will think of this shape and these shapes, so a kind of house-shaped monolithic stone with, although here you can see many engravings. In fact, when we look at the totality of the standing stones, most of them don't have any decoration on them, so it's only about around 20% of them that have any kind of decoration on them. And finally, this like shape also for specific types of crosses, which we normally call, usually they're so-called anthropomorphic crosses, because the upper part is rounded, so it actually resembles more a human figure rather than a standard shape of the cross. And if we look at the kind of map, this map goes back to the 1960s, which was the last time when a systematic kind of survey of all the Stečak stones were carried out. And this should definitely be done again, but this is what we have for now. And each dot represents one necropolis of these stones. So, I mean, you can quite clearly see immediately that they are all centered around most of the territories of modern-day Bosnia and Herzegovina, with the greatest density in the region of Herzegovina and here in eastern Bosnia. However, they're not just limited to modern-day Bosnia and Herzegovina. We can also find them along the Dalmatian coast, in parts of Montenegro, and also here in modern-day Serbia. And based on this last survey, we have a number of approximately 65,000 stones, which is really, you know, the most impressive fact about this phenomenon, because no other country in Europe has such a large number of surviving tombstones from the medieval period. However, if we look more into their actual historical context, so when the majority of the stones were erected, which is the period of the 14th and 15th century. This is the period when the most of the territories were governed by the medieval Bosnian state, which in the 14th century also became a kingdom. And this, here you can see the borders when it was at its greatest extent under the king Pr-Ottoman. And again, if you think of the previous map, it seems it's quite an obvious fact, I would say, that the territories based, or the phenomenon of the Stečak can be primarily linked to the medieval Bosnian state. And now we will come to some more detailed look at the stones. So how do we actually know, for example, when they were erected, and some more basic facts? Unfortunately, there haven't been any large-scale systematic archaeological excavation of the stone, so that we would have more precise information. And within this situation, our most reliable source are actually the inscriptions, which you can see here. And they're very rare, so from the total number of more than 65,000 stones, only about 300 have some very short inscriptions. Written in the medieval Bosnian language, which is also, and in the script which we call Bosnian Cyrillic, sometimes Bosančica, so it's a type of Cyrillic, but with some specific characteristics that tie to the area of Bosnia. And this particular stone is very interesting. Actually, you can see this original in the National Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it is particularly interesting because it names the person who is buried underneath, and this is Gost Milutin. And this title of Gost allows us to link this particular stone to the medieval Bosnian church, which is, we will come to this. I mean, we could have a whole lecture or a series of lectures just on the questions of the medieval Bosnian church. But what we know for sure is that there was this independent institution which had its own kind of titles. It didn't have exactly the same titles as the Catholic Orthodox churches, and one of the highest dignitaries of the Bosnian church was called Gost. So this was his title. And here we actually see a representation of this dignitary of the Bosnian church with two, as we call in iconography, attributes, so things that are attached to one person and that in a way identify this person or say some important things about about his status and role. And one thing he's holding is a book, and this we can presume that this is the Bible that he's holding, because in this period it was one of the main characteristics of the Bosnian church that they insisted on reading the actual text of the Bible and translating it into the local language, which was not the practice within the Catholic Church of this period. And also he's holding a walking stick, which also shows a characteristic of the Bosnian church and the dignitaries, that they were not attached to one particular location, but they were, as we call it, they were itinerant, so they were going around and tending to the needs of their communities. And so now we come just to this really complicated question, as I already said, to the possible connections between the Stečak stones and the Bosnian church. And there are quite serious arguments about this issue, and I will just kind of quickly go through the main issues without going into detail to provide an answer. So the main questions that we're facing when we study the Bosnian church is whether it was, as we call it, neo-Manichaean pattern or just a schismatic or primitive form of the Christian church. And neo-Manichaean pattern means that it belonged to a completely separate strand of Christianity that was quite different from the development of the Catholic and Orthodox Church. Or was it very similar? That this would be the other theory, that it was in fact very similar to the Orthodox churches, but it was just, as we say, schismatic, so separated in a kind of organizational structure. The second question that we face when we ask what are the Stečak, so who were they produced by, and three possible answers have been given: that it was monoconfessional, so that it was erected only by members of the Bosnian church. The second one is interconfessional, which means it was erected by all three communities or church structures in medieval Bosnia, which was the Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Bosnian church. Or something actually that I suggest in my theory, that it was supra-confessional, so that it was actually that there was a kind of, as we can call it nominally, Bosnian Christianity that was then secondarily divided eventually into the different confessions. And finally, the question is, when we look at the symbols and the depictions that I will look at in a few moments, are they sacred, spiritual? So do these symbols actually have some kind of religious level of significance, or are they merely secular, quotidian? As in, for example, if we see a hunter hunting a stag, is this simply a representation of the everyday lives of the people, or does it have some kind of religious and symbolic levels of significance? And I will just briefly have to cover this very complex issue of the Bosnian church before we come to the actual imagery of the stone. So we often hear, and this would be the traditional historiographic view, that the Bosnian church was a dualist heresy. And what would this mean? So the word heresy comes from the Greek eidesis, which originally meant choice. So this word comes from the ancient Mediterranean world, the Roman Empire, when there were many different religions coexisting at the same time, and the word heresy simply meant choosing one of these religions. And eventually it came to mean a party or a school of choice. However, over a long period, with the rise of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, eventually it would be, heresy would mean an opinion chosen by human perception, contrary to Holy Scripture, publicly avowed and obstinately defended. So eventually heresy was defined as something that is explicitly considered as wrong. There was only one right way of thinking and one right way of believing, and everything that wasn't in accordance with that was described as a heresy. And here we have what was actually a legal definition of heresy in this period. So there are many different components, which I will just briefly read. So the spreading and following of false beliefs, an interpretation of the Bible that is not in accordance with the Roman Church, separation from the sacraments, simony, which means buying of church services and positions, publicly expressed doubt in religion, and the slightest disagreement with Orthodox teaching. So this is really important. It means that if somebody had even the tiniest disagreement with the official idea of Christianity and what the Pope said, which is also the denial of the papal jurisdictional primacy. So if there was even a tiny disagreement, you could be accused of heresy in this period, and the punishment was, burning to death in this period. So it was considered as a very serious crime. And if we take this very strict definition of heresy in this period, we can say for sure that in Bosnia we did have a heresy at this time, because we have many documents where the Pope explicitly says that the Bosnian Christians do not adhere to the right version of Christianity. What about dualism? Also, just one second. Also a very complex issue that I will just briefly touch on here. So dualism is usually defined as the belief that the universe was created or is governed by two divine beings. So there's not just one God, but there are two gods who can stand in different kinds of relationships to each other. So they can either be equal, or they can be ultimately one supreme God with one being inferior. And the interesting thing is that when we think about it, it's actually very difficult to separate dualism from also monotheistic religions, because we have, particularly in Christianity, the very strong role of Satan in the material world. So there are definitely elements of dualism. But historically it goes back to usually it's considered that the original dualistic religion was Zoroastrianism in ancient Iran, in ancient Persia. But then over time, actually, these movements that we had in medieval Europe, in contemporary sources, they're most commonly described as Neo-Manichaean. And Manichaeanism was also a religion that originated in modern-day Iraq, which was part of the Persian world, and which also adhered to a kind of dualistic worldview, which basically means that it considered the main kind of theological point there is that the material world was governed by this evil deity, or that's then equated with Satan. And here we have actually links that have been documented. So we have contemporary documents that testify that there were these links that are shown with these arrows. Of course, there are scholars who disagree with this. It's possible to argue that these sources were fake, that they were not well informed. But if we look at how contemporary Europeans of this time describe the appearance of these movements that they considered as heresies, they said that it originally came from the Middle East, from the Manichaeans, and then through the Paulicians, who were a religious movement that emerged in the early medieval Armenia and fought against the Byzantine Empire for a long time. And then they influenced the Bogomils in Bulgaria, and the Bogomils in turn influenced Western European Cathars. Here, and in this region, the southwest of modern-day France, they actually became very powerful in the 12th century, so that the Catholic Church organized a crusade, a famous crusade against the Cathars, where many were killed, and ultimately this belief was destroyed. And what's just missing from this map is the name Paterens. So in Italy, and also in fact in Bosnia, they were usually not called. This is kind of still remains when today you may hear that in medieval Bosnia we had Bogomils. Strictly speaking, this is not the right term. We do not encounter the term Bogomils in Bosnia. Usually they're described as Paterens, so same as the Italian heretics of this period. And now we come to the question, so I've just briefly covered this religious complexities of the environment, and then we come to the question, so we have these images found on the stones, and how do we go about actually interpreting them? How do we know what they were meant to represent, or under what kind of structure? And this is a very complex issue, because if we look at the history of the Christian attitudes towards visual arts, it's actually, there have been many conflicts, with the most famous one being, of course, the Iconoclastic conflict, where for a period of over 100 years there was something as a kind of civil war within the Byzantine Empire between one side that supported the banning of religious images and another side that supported the usage of religious images. And eventually, over time, what the churches, the official churches, developed a justification why art should be used. So why should it be allowed, even though the Bible is quite clear that, you know, you shouldn't make images of the gods, etc. So there was something, theory that I have termed the propagandistic conception of art, and this we find in many sources in the medieval period, where the church actually justifies using images for three reasons: as a Bible for the illiterate, so if you cannot read the Bible, you can look at the images in churches; as an arouser of emotion, so if you see these dramatic images of Jesus, etc., you will develop religious emotions; and as an aid to memory, so it will be easier to remember religious truths and teachings. However, why I looked for alternatives is, as you will see in a moment, as soon as you look at the Stečak imagery, it's clear that it does not really fit this image, because it doesn't show any kind of biblical imagery, doesn't show any of the standard images that could be considered, you know, Bible for the illiterate. But if they have some meaning, then clearly you had to kind of know how to interpret them. You had to receive a specific key in which you can read these images. So that's why I looked for alternatives, and in fact there is a different idea about what art serves, and it goes back to ancient Greece, and this is what I've called the mystical conception of art. And many thinkers, it comes from the philosophical movement of Neoplatonism and was eventually taken over in Christianity. And the idea was that the point of art, or the purpose of art, is not to actually depict nature and physical images, but to point towards higher truths, towards religious ideas, and towards, if you want, like a kind of different dimension. And this is what I've kind of approached the imagery of the Stečak with. In fact, I've kind of tried to make a combination of these two. What I've argued is that the images may not necessarily have only one meaning. meaning. So it's possible that maybe, as I mentioned, the stag hunt, for one person it could represent a simple daytime activity, while for those who were sufficiently religiously educated, they could have they could have additional specific layers of meaning, as it was the case also, for example, in the ancient Christian world, when the first early persecuted Christians had to hide their beliefs because of the persecution of the Roman Church. So now I actually come to the statues themselves and their imagery, and the first thing I want to briefly discuss is the style in which they were carved. So as you can see here in one of the most famous maybe images of the statue, even though it's very rare, it's kind of strange, this type of symbol with the raised right hand appears only on maybe 6 or 7 stones, but it's become kind of iconic of this entire art. And what you can see immediately is that it's a very flat way of carving. So the images are not carved three-dimensionally, but in what's called in history of art also the flat relief. So a very shallow type of engraving. And why would that? Well, many scholars in the past thought that simply, they were not able. Technically, they did not know how to carve better images, but and here, just to compare with the style that we find in Western Europe in this same period, I will not go into the iconography now, which is also very different, what is depicted. As you can see in this period in Western Europe, we already have three-dimensional sculpture, which for a long time was completely forbidden in Christianity as idolatrous. So why did these differences appear, and is it simply a question of technical skill? I think it actually has reasons. There are religious, let's call them, reasons for this, and to show just why, maybe I show you one church which maybe some people from Turkey may recognize. It's the church on Lake an Armenian church located in Lake Van on the island of Ahtamar, and it's from the 8th century. And if you look at the way the images are carved on this church, you see that it's a similar style with a flat relief. That they didn't use three-dimensional structures either, and this was precisely for that reason that I already listed, that three-dimensional sculpture was banned or was forbidden within Christianity, as it is also, for example, in Islam still today. And this is also, so for a long time the Armenian art was actually characterized by this flat style of carving. And in fact, this is my own photograph when I visited there a few years ago. In fact, they have, it's something that's not really well known or not known at all in art historical studies, but they actually have some stones that look very similar to the statue, and I think that this goes back to also a longer tradition, Central Asia, and even today. This is unfortunately not my photograph. I didn't visit Western China, where Uyghur people live, but still today they use these type of gravestones that, in a way, in its basic conception, seem to have some similarities with the household stone. And I'm just going to these quite distant examples because in medieval Europe we simply cannot find this same type of stone, so they must have a different origin. Also in Dagestan, something that looks possibly related to this tradition. Also a link, as you will see later, is this particular symbol, which appears very frequently on the Bosnian tombstones. And now I come to the actual iconography of what the types of symbols that we find on the statue stones. And there is a lot of debate about the cross, and the cross is the most frequent symbol found on the stones. That's something that's maybe sometimes not familiar. And often you will hear scholars saying that, some scholars saying that because you can see the cross on the stones, it means it could not have belonged to the Bosnian church or any kind of these so-called heretical movement, because there are many documents in which observers say that these heretical movements, they did not accept the symbol of the cross. So the argument is, if you have the cross, it cannot belong to the Bosnian church. However, I mean, the first thing we notice is, despite many different shapes of the crosses that we find, and I showed only a few of them here, in fact, there is a really noticeable absence, and that is the crucifixion. Because if you look at Western and also Eastern Christian art of this period, the crucifixion, so Jesus on the cross, is the most common shape, and we can never find this shown on the statued stones. And if we actually go to the contemporary sources that talk about the Bogomil Paulician attitude towards the cross, here this is one original document from 12th century, and says, "Then the patriarch said again, 'Why do you not believe in and honor the precious cross?' He said, 'Anathema to him who does not worship and venerate the precious and life-giving cross.' By cross he meant Christ making a cross by holding out his arms." So what this shows is that the Paulicians and the Bogomils did accept the cross, but it was a symbol of Christ, as it says here, Christ making a cross. So it was the gesture of spreading out the arms by Jesus, rather than the idea of his crucifixion. And this is a very important idea for the whole conception of their attitude and of their understanding of the role of Jesus as a divine messenger. And this attitude, even though that's why it's important to think about this term heresy, because usually we mean heresy, or actually we understand heresy as something that's wrong or that's distinct. But if we look at many of these attitudes, in fact, these so-called heretical attitudes are much closer to original Christianity than the later attitudes of the Orthodox churches. And here is just one example. Justin Martyr, one of the earliest Christian theologians from the 3rd century, he talks about why the cross is important for Christians, and it's not, he never mentions he doesn't mention the crucifixion of Jesus, but he says, "Consider all the things in the world, whether without this form they could be administered or have any community, and the human form differs from that of the irrational animals in nothing else than in its being erect and having the hands extended," etc. So what he's saying is that the cross is actually an abstract symbol that is intimately tied to the human being. So when the human spread out their arms, then you get a cross also in the face between the nose and the eyes. And so the cross was understood much more as a mystical symbol rather than as a depiction of the crucifixion of Christ. And just if I go back to this shape, which is one of the more original, let's say, shapes of the cross found on the statued stones, at least I, in my research, have never come across this type of cross in any other contexts in the Christian world. And this can also, as you can see, it actually has, maybe it's not so clearly visible, but it's a type of cross with spirals and then grapes growing out of these spirals. And this can also be explained through actually something that we can find in the Bible itself, where John quotes Jesus saying, "I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener," etc., etc. So Jesus compares himself to the vine and to its branches. And what's interesting about this topic is that it mentions the word clean. You're already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. And in the original Greek, the word for clean is katharoi. And the Cathars, so the related movement that I talked about in the south of France, was named Cathars, and they insisted on the value, on the significance of purity and of internal cleanliness. And here a second symbol that we will look at is the aura, that actually appears a lot more frequently on the statuette stones, and than this shape with the human being with only one raised hand. So the orant, that's what we named this particular shape, so a human being with both arms raised high up. And sometimes they appear like this, just a single one, sometimes holding hands between other figures, etc. So it appears in many, I think more than 100 cases. And what is actually the orant? Where does this particular orant, actually the word itself comes from Latin. Orare means to pray, so it means the praying figure. And if we go back to the earliest Christian art, the catacombs in Rome, it's the main symbol. Still, even it's older than the cross, and most Christian graves of this period are marked precisely by this figure, the orant, so the human being with the raised hands. And in fact, we have also written evidence that this is the form in which early Christians actually prayed. This is one of the sources, the Odes of Solomon, that was apocryphal work that was not included in the Bible, but it was used by many early Christian communities, and it says, "I extended my hands and hallowed my Lord, for the expansion of my hands is his sign." So the sign of Lord, the sign of Jesus Christ, is precisely that's the raising of the arms. And my extension is the upright cross. So we can also read the symbolism of the cross in this gesture of the raised arms. And what's interesting is that this image largely disappears from Christian art around the 5th, 6th century. We can only sometimes find the Virgin Mary or exceptionally some saints depicted in this posture, but never kind of normal Christians, let's call them, so average believers. And then it appears again in medieval Bosnia, which again shows that this artistic tradition, which is my kind of thesis, has some links to the earliest Christian world. And here just another example. The orant is not just a Christian symbol. The raised arms we can find in some of the oldest art, for example, in Central Asia, and pictograms of Central Asia, and many other religious traditions as well. But an interesting one comes again from the Bible, from the Old Testament, a kind of almost a somewhat funny part in it, where there is a battle between the Israelites and Amalekites, and so as long as Moses, it says, as long as Moses was holding up his arms like that, the Israelites were winning, and when he put them down, they were losing. So what they did, they actually, like two other people were holding, Aaron and Hur held his hands up on one side, on one on the other. So they held his hands like that, and that enabled the Israelites to carry out this battle victoriously. So here just a few more examples of the orant appearing on the statuette stones, and I find this one particularly interesting because it's one of those cases which we find often on the stones where we cannot say for sure what one image represents. So does this actually represent an abstract human figure with raised arms, or is it actually a cross or a kind of fusion between those two symbols? Here also one particular famous example from the necropolis Grotnice, where it clearly shows some kind of religious ceremony being carried out with the moon here and the rosette, and somehow, you know, a communication with higher forces. The crescent, directly after the cross, the most frequent image or symbol found on the statuette stones is the crescent, and which is, of course, again quite unusual because the crescent is something we normally associate with Islam. However, it has this much longer, older tradition here, and as far as I know, that nobody has really managed to give a fully satisfactory explanation for this image. What's interesting is that most frequently it's just this crescent, and there are no crosses. So when you have a crescent, there is no cross. And of course we can speculate, the cross as a masculine symbol, the crescent as a feminine, but there is no kind of evidence or no sources that would tell us why this crescent was an important symbol. And sometimes, quite rarely, but we find it also in a combination with the cross. So this is taken from the Radimlja necropolis near Stolac. And one of the, for me, most interesting explanations or possible theories of the crescent was given by important scholar Alexander Soloviev, because he studied Manichaeans, and his idea was that we can interpret this imagery through Manichaeanism. And what he said, he found some sources that talk about the Manichaean belief that the moon or the crescent was a ship of light transporting the souls of the deceased to the other world, because in this view human souls were considered to be fragments of light within the human being. And here we have actually one source, ancient source, Epiphanius of Salamis, who talks about Mani. So he claims that the sun, the moon, and the stars, they pull the souls of the deceased from the earth. And the sun, that great ship, carries them into eternal life in the land of the blessed. And just again, interesting parallel, which may be related. I mean, I haven't unfortunately managed to find out that much about the art of the Mandeans, a rather obscure religious group that until recently existed only in Iraq, where they survived since the early Christian times. They were kind of Gnostic types of Christians, and many of them were actually persecuted now and moved to the United States. And in their art, we often find the moon as a kind of ship, representation of a ship of these divine beings, which are again represented in this particular shape that we will find on the Stečak stones. And one more particular image that I want to talk about, which can be maybe described as the most original contribution of Stečak art, because at least as far as I know, this particular kolo, as we call, or the circle dance, is not really an important motif in any other artistic tradition that I have looked at, and it's shown on many different stones in various shapes, so like in many figures with only 2 figures. We have also even this some kind of maybe representation of a dance. And what could this be? Of course, circle dances are attested in many different traditions around burials. So often in many different traditions in the world they would carry out such dances during burials. However, we have a lot of evidence that this was actively persecuted in the Catholic Church of this period, so it was considered a pagan custom and not really Christian. So it's difficult to conclude that this could be tied or at least propagated by the Catholic Church of this period. The only possible parallel in this period is this motif of the so-called danse macabre, which we find in many European churches of this period. And it is a kind of dance where people are holding hands, but as you can, I think, also see immediately, it's very different. It has these skeletons and then different representations of different human beings, of different, actually usually different classes. So often you would have the king and then some nobles and down to the lowest strata of society. And the idea was that death is a force that kind of levels all social differences. and it's a frequent motif in Catholic art of this period, but I think there is no direct connection between these two. I've looked for alternatives, and again, if we look at the earliest Christians and some of their apocryphal writings, like the Acts of John, that were also banned eventually within the church, we actually have one chapter called the Round Dance of the Cross. So it was, in fact, one particular, at least one version of Christianity. They were carrying out these types of round dances. They were considered sacred dances. Of course, it's difficult to suggest a direct connection between the early Gnosticism and the medieval Bosnian church, but it's an indication that there may have been some kind of alternative conceptions of Christianity that did not use these orthopractic customs. I will slowly reach the end, just one more motif. So there's really, on only two cases you see this dance led by a stag, which brings us to this next motif, which is the stag or the deer, also one of the very frequent motifs found on the Stečak stones. And some scholars have suggested that, well, they were just kind of feudal lords and they liked to go hunting, and that's why they depicted stag hunts on their tombstones. But I don't think this is a very convincing theory, because in fact we find them like on their own many times, also as you saw before, leading the sacred dance. We also find solar symbolism in their antlers, etc. And even in at least one case we find something that looks like a human being with stag's antlers. And what could this be? Again, we can actually find a possible explanation within the Bible itself, which compares the deer or the stag to the soul that's yearning for God. So as the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. And this idea is actually quite frequently depicted in Christian art of the early Middle Ages. Here, for example, in Georgia, in the 7th century, we see stags drinking from this well, which probably represents this idea of the soul yearning for God. However, it's a much older symbol, and this is just one of many examples. Again, I already mentioned the Central Asian traditions, the Scythian tradition. Some of the oldest art in the world actually shows the stag as one of the major symbols, and it's believed that there was an association between the antlers and certain shamanic states, so people who could communicate with higher forces, which is perhaps shown here in the so-called Gundestrup cauldron that was found in modern-day Denmark, and it's from the 1st century. It's from Celtic art, and it shows a kind of presumably a spiritual figure surrounded by animals and sitting in this state, and also with stags, with antlers, stags' antlers. And now the question would be, why would they, if the stag really in some way represents a spiritual leader, why would they represent a stag hunt? And here a possible explanation is that, again, according to an ancient and early Christian belief, one of the ideals of the early Christians was martyrdom, so to die for their faith. And they actually believed that if you want to be a true Christian, you will inevitably come into conflict with the dark forces of this world. And in medieval Bosnia, we know for a fact that the Bosnian Christians were actually persecuted many times, so the stag hunt may actually be a symbolic representation of the persecution of the true Christians. Okay, as we're reaching the end, so just the Fleur-De-Lys, also a very common symbol, usually interpreted as taken over from the Bosnian medieval coat of arms. But again, I'm not completely convinced, because if you just want to show the coat of arms, why not show the actual coat of arms? And then instead they represented the Fleur-De-Lys in these really strange shapes that we call anthropomorphic Fleur-De-Lys. So it also has a possible spiritual, let's say, religious explanation, in that the Fleur-De-Lys was usually considered the symbol of the Virgin Mary in many traditions, who usually had the title in the Christian world of Theotokos, which means the God-bearer, because she carried Jesus in her womb. However, in these alternative so-called heretical traditions, actually the true Christians were considered the carriers of God, because the idea was, if you lead a virtuous life, if you hold on to these rules, then actually, the Holy Spirit, God, dwells within each human being. So this could also be linked possibly to this idea of the true Christians as the carriers of divinity. Finally, just for the end, I want to point to a rather sad fact that this is actually one Stečak necropolis located not far from Sarajevo, and unfortunately, even though recently some of them were included on the UNESCO World Heritage List, the Bosnian state is not really, paying any attention to them, and they're decaying, they're being destroyed. So probably we may be the last generation to be able to actually study the stones systematically. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I have one question.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about the similarities or differences between Bogomils and what was the name?
Paterens.
And those group in France?
Yeah. Well, in fact, the problem is like with the Bosnian church, that we have almost no direct sources because they were all destroyed. So we don't have documents written by the Paterens or by the Cathars by themselves who say we believe this. It was always written by the enemies, the Catholic Church, who tried to destroy them. So we have unreliable sources. But if we look at these sources, they always describe them as very similar. And all the medieval sources say that the Paterens and the Cathars came from either Bulgaria or from the Byzantine Empire. So, and there's one source which actually even says that they're synonyms, that they are the same, that they're called Bogomils in the Byzantine Empire and Paterens or Cathars in the Western world. And we also have a direct evidence of communication, and even in Bosnia itself. So we have some sources from Italy saying that some of these heretics actually came to Bosnia to learn more about the true faith. And for one period when all these movements were persecuted all over Europe, Bosnia was the only country where they were tolerated. And that's why this culture flourished more, when already by the mid-13th century it was pretty much destroyed in France, and it only then developed fully in Bosnia. And I have to add, there was also a crusade against Bosnia led by Hungary to try to destroy them, but it was not successful, so they did not manage to destroy. This was in the 12th century, and then it flourished for a while.
Okay, thank you.
Yes?
I was just wondering, I think it's a very interesting discussion. And when you engage with the theoretical framework to explain what these meanings mean, what literature do you engage with? I'm just wondering, because I'm sort of working on an article that looks at Islam's opposition to graven images. And I'm looking at stuff like W.J.T. Mitchell and Julian Rose's explanation of representation as meaning making. So how did you frame some of your more general claims about what this stuff actually meant? And did you use post-structuralist framework? Did you use something more traditional?
Well, actually, I started with the more traditional iconography / iconology of Panofsky, which is a bit dated, but I worked on the idea of three levels of meaning that he he proposed like a natural level, conventional level, and a symbolic level. And then, because I was concerned with the Christian world, I looked at reception practices in the Christian world. But now I just one name is escaping me. But when we finish, ask me again. One very important sorry, I will tell you in a few minutes. One Oxford historian of art, which I found really, very good. It helped me to find some of my own theoretical frame. I have one more question.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was a really interesting lecture. If you could maybe shed more light on the customs habits of Bosnian church members. According to some studies, they actually draw parallels between Bosnian church and Islam in terms of praying 5 times a day, mandatory washing before praying. So, any details?
Yeah. This is also really, big question and big topic. This idea also between not just similarities, but the idea of direct links, and as a kind of explanation why Bosnia became Islamicized quite rapidly is because of the similarities. In my research, I did not find such detailed. There is no direct historical evidence that this idea of praying 5 times a day. I don't know about this and the washing. But what I know, the main sources are. It was a much stricter version than the standard Christianity. So if you actually, first of all, they didn't baptize children. That was considered meaningless. But you could only become Christian at a certain age and when you follow some very certain rules. However, one of the most interesting ideas of these links is that there is this concept of the Paraclete, which is the Holy, sometimes translated as the Holy Spirit, and sometimes as the Comforter, which you find in the Bible, and that in these heretical movements, so-called, I always add heretical, they actually expected this Paraclete to come, to come back to earth. So they, in some versions, they expected a new messenger, and then when Islam came, that Muhammad was represented as this messenger that sent the final message, and that led to a certain symbiosis of the Bosnian Church and Islam. However, it has to be added that sometimes this is used a bit uncritically, that simply the Ottoman Empire came and then the Bosnian Christians just couldn't wait to convert to Islam because they were so similar. In fact, if we look at it objectively, there were many different, so the conversions went in many different directions. Some became Orthodox, some became Catholic, some Catholics became Muslim, etc. So it's quite a complex issue that unfortunately has not been sufficiently studied, and I consider it one of the biggest questions of Bosnian history, and hopefully someone will dedicate themselves to that. I think we...
If I may ask one.
Oh, you have one, okay.
Thank you for this refreshing lecture and discussion. The color figures.
The which figures? Color, yeah?
Figures. Were they from the Stechi in Bosnia or from other regions?
Actually, most symbolism, Herzegovina is much richer in imagery. So most of these images are actually from the Herzegovina region, but they also appear in Bosnia. And Eastern Bosnia is a bit different in that it's much more abstract. So it only has these spirals and rosettes, and very rarely any human figures.
Did you see them outside Bosnia and Herzegovina?
You mean on the Stečak stone? Yeah, and Dalmatia also has some of these. Like one I showed is Brotnice, I'll show you. So for example, this one is in Croatia, but it's just on the border of the one on the left is from Croatia.
Anywhere in Central Asia or?
Well, I hope, I haven't really, I mean, it's quite difficult even to find literature on Central Asian art, so I'm still hoping, you know, in the future maybe. So I'm sure it will emerge somewhere.
Well, you already mentioned that it appears, I mean, in different regions. It is related with circle dancing, which did exist and still does exist in other regions. Originally coming from Eastern Black Sea, it immediately reminded me of Poron. So, I mean, I'm wondering if, I mean, we have such figures in, you know, Eastern Black Sea, if there's any kind of combination between them.
Well, you know what, sometimes it may, you know, when I talk to some, it seems a bit far-fetched to think, you know, there's links between Dagestan and Bosnia. But in fact, when the first Slavs settled in Bosnia, they were Avar Slavic Confederation. And in modern day Dagestan is still an Avar majority. So there may well have been some actual direct historical links between those two regions.
So there's a lot to be discovered.
A lot, yeah.
If there are no more questions?
If there are no more questions, I'd like to personally thank Dr. Gorčin Dizdar hereby raising the platform here. Thank you very much. Special thanks go to Dr. Dizdar for being with us today, for giving this very well-prepared summary of all your studies, maybe in the past few years. Special thanks for illuminating us about the Stechak, a very curious subject matter that I've been personally trying to learn. So now, looking backwards, I tell myself that I've made the right decision. I've been scheduled to attend to this Sarajevo Business Forum, but I postponed my schedule there to be with you here, so that was certainly the right decision. If I might add just one thing about the pre-Islamic Turks, used to have similar tombstones. They would call those stones balbals. Here I've got, I don't know whether you've got your internet connection here, maybe you can just show to the audience what they look like, but they are very curious tombstones. If it is connected.
Yeah, sometimes it works.
Okay, so the story goes on like this. The Turks, pre-Islamic Turks, would be warriors. I'm talking of the Turks living in Central Asia. So those gallant Turks would kill, and when they die, these tombstones would be erected around their graves, representing the people, the warriors that they personally killed during battles. So if 7 of them were surrounding the tombstone, then that would mean that they really killed those 7 like indestructible warriors of the enemy. And these tombstones on them would have facial figures and would usually hold some cups or sometimes like play some instruments, representing that those balbals would be serving the Turk within that tomb in the afterlife. So the Turks, even before Islam, had the idea of the afterlife. So that was maybe so for some of the historians or history people for history of art, might be a very interesting topic, and you might be even trying to use it in your future studies, maybe a link between Stechak and the balbals. The word Balbal also is found in the Philippines mythology as a monster, as an undead monster eating the corpses of the recently deceased people. They would only feed on the deceased people, on the corpses, but nothing else. So they would be very fearful, some creatures according to the beliefs. One more addition, if I may. Can you please come back to the one of the slides with the lady with the deer antlers?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't think it's a lady. They have men.
Here, this one, no, this one.
Oh, okay. In Denmark.
Yeah, so you said that there are not many explanations for this, but I certainly see a close link between this figure and the Greek mythology, in which we have this myth of Diana, the goddess of hunting, and the Actaeon, the hunter, who accidentally sees Diana, the goddess, naked, bathing somewhere in a secret place, and unfortunately is penalized or like transformed by the goddess into a deer figure, who later is followed by his own hounds and beaten into pieces, and is dead. So there might be a relation between this.
There is also an early Christian saint, Eustache, who is converted into. I mean, we find a stag with the cross as a symbol.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Dizdar. It's nice to have you here as a professor also, and I hope to see you more here in our faculty. Thank you very much.
And please join Dr. Dizdar for refreshments in the lobby. We have them waiting for you.